Reclaiming our spiritual birthright, the power of ancestral traditions. When Gwendolyn Huertas speaks about spirituality, something shifts in the room. There's a palpable energy, a confidence that radiates from her very being. This remarkable woman has dedicated her life to helping Black individuals reclaim their ancestral spiritual practices, and in doing so, has ignited a movement of spiritual liberation that continues to transform countless lives. Her work isn't just about preserving traditions, it's about restoring dignity, power, and wholeness to communities that have been systematically disconnected from their spiritual roots. Have you ever wondered why certain spiritual practices are celebrated while others are feared? Why some rituals are considered sacred while others are labeled as dangerous or primitive? The answer isn't about the practices themselves, it's about power. It's about who gets to define what's holy and what's taboo. For generations, Black people have been taught to fear their own spiritual heritage. Words like voodoo, conjure, and ritual have been whispered with warning, painted as something dark, something to run from. But as Gwendolyn so powerfully articulated in our conversation, these traditions aren't something to fear, they're something to reclaim. They're our birthright. I want to take you on a journey today. Not my journey, but one illuminated by Gwendolyn's insights and supported by historical truths that have too often been suppressed or distorted. This is a story about spiritual liberation, about dropping the cape of others' expectations and embracing the authentic path that resonates with your soul. Because in this era of reclaiming our right to define ourselves, nothing is more revolutionary than spiritual authenticity. Let's start with the truth that shook the world: the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804. This wasn't just any uprising, this was the only successful slave revolt that led to the founding of a nation. And at its heart, Vodou. On August 14th, 1791, something extraordinary happened in the forest of Bois Caiman. Enslaved leaders gathered for a Vodou ceremony led by a priest named Duty Boukman and a priestess named Cecile Feriman. Under the cover of night, they called upon their ancestors. They forged unity through ritual. They found courage in spiritual connection. Days later, the revolution began. The French colonizers had spent years trying to strip these enslaved Africans of their spiritual practices, forcing Christianity upon them while demonizing their ancestral traditions. Why? Because they recognized something the enslaved people knew in their bones. These practices weren't just spiritual, they were revolutionary. They contained the power to unite, to inspire, to transform. The Haitian Revolution succeeded against impossible odds. The enslaved defeated Napoleon's army, the most powerful military force in the world at that time. They established the first Black republic in the Western Hemisphere, and they did it with the strength of their ancestral spiritual traditions flowing through their veins. This isn't ancient history. This is our legacy. As Gwendolyn emphasized, spirituality is deeply personal and should not be confined by societal norms or external expectations. Many Black people have been taught to fear or reject practices like voodoo, rituals, and spells, but these are ancestral traditions and forms of empowerment, not witchcraft. Let that sink in for a moment. What if the very practices we've been taught to fear are actually sources of our power? Throughout American history, Black women especially have preserved these traditions, often in secret, often at great risk. They practice what scholars now call conjure, a sophisticated system of spiritual and practical wisdom that help communities survive and even thrive under oppression. These women weren't practicing black magic as the dominant narrative would have us believe. They were community healers, protectors, and leaders. They used herbs to heal when doctors wouldn't treat black bodies. They created protective rituals when the law offered no protection. They managed luck and fortune when economic systems were designed for their failure. As explored in Lindsay Stewart's book, The Conjuring of America, these practices weren't primitive superstitions. They were sophisticated responses to oppression, blending spiritual wisdom with practical survival strategies. Consider the story of enslaved and marginalized Black women who faced violence, disenfranchisement, and limited access to formal power structures through practices rooted in West African spirituality, such as luck management, herbal medicine, and protective rituals. These women created safety nets for themselves and their communities. These traditions fostered resilience, healing, and continuity across generations, with knowledge passed down through families and community networks. Despite being dismissed as superstition or witchcraft, these practices were sophisticated responses to oppression, blending spiritual and practical wisdom. The survival and flourishing of Black communities in hostile environments owe much to these often unrecognized forms of leadership and care. The legacy of these conjure women continues today, influencing both Black feminist thought and contemporary spiritual movements. These conjure women passed their knowledge down through generations, often in whispers, often disguised within Christian practices to avoid persecution. Their legacy lives on today, influencing both Black feminist thought and contemporary spiritual movements. This is our inheritance. This is our birthright. And yet, so many of us have been disconnected from these traditions. We've been taught to fear them, to see them as primitive or even evil. We've internalized the very narratives that were designed to separate us from our power. As Gwendolyn so eloquently stated, Voodoo and similar spiritual traditions are part of our birthright and cultural legacy. These practices have been demonized by outside forces, yet they played a pivotal role in Black resistance and survival. West African Vodou remains a living tradition among the Aya, Uva, and Fon peoples. It has spread globally, including among Black diasporic communities, reclaiming their heritage. Despite being misrepresented and stigmatized as witchcraft or evil, practitioners maintain rituals, divination, and ancestral veneration, often blending these with Christianity or other faiths to preserve their identity. The continued practice and global spread of Vodou have fostered pride, community, and a sense of spiritual ownership among Black people worldwide. Amid the trauma of the Atlantic slave trade, Vodou and related traditions became sources of strength, adaptability, and cultural memory. Since the 1990s, initiatives have encouraged people of African descent to reconnect with Vodou, challenging stigma and fostering transnational solidarity. The revitalization of Vodou contributes to cultural renaissance and spiritual healing in the Black diaspora. But here's where it gets personal. Here's where Gwendolyn's message resonates most deeply. Walking in your spiritual truth can open doors and give life new purpose. Embracing your authentic spiritual path, even when it challenges mainstream beliefs, can lead to personal transformation and a sense of belonging within a larger community. This isn't about rejecting Christianity or any other faith tradition, if that's where you find meaning. It's about questioning the narratives that have taught us to fear and reject certain spiritual practices simply because they come from Africa, simply because they weren't sanctioned by colonial powers. It's about asking, who benefits when I fear my own ancestral wisdom? Who gains power when I reject practices that might empower me? For high achieving Black women, especially, those who have spent years in survival mode, leading teams, raising families, holding down households, carrying communities. This spiritual reclamation is revolutionary. It's about shifting from constantly grinding to finally grounding in joy, peace, softness, and self prioritization. Because the truth is, many of us are exhausted. We've been strong for so long. We've carried so much. We've worn the cape of the superwoman, taking pride in our ability to endure, to overcome, to push through. But what if true strength lies in softness? What if power comes not from enduring hardship, but from embracing joy? What if our ancestors practiced these spiritual traditions not just to survive, but to thrive? As Gwendolyn reminds us, these traditions weren't just about protection from harm, they were about calling in abundance, love, community, and joy. They were about connecting with something larger than ourselves, with our ancestors, with nature, with the divine as we understand it. They were about wholeness. So, what does this mean for us today? How do we reclaim these traditions in the world that still misunderstands and fears them? Gwendolyn encourages us to start by challenging inherited beliefs about spirituality and questioning narratives that demonize ancestral traditions. Research your own spiritual heritage. Talk openly about your experiences. Explore practices that resonate with your authentic self. This isn't about following a prescribed path, it's about finding your own way, guided by ancestral wisdom, but shaped by your unique journey. It's about asking, what practices bring me peace? What rituals connect me to something larger than myself? What traditions help me feel whole? I stand before you today with a challenge, a call to spiritual revolution. I challenge you to examine the narratives you've inherited about spirituality. I challenge you to question who defined what's sacred and what's taboo in your life. I challenge you to reclaim the practices that have been demonized, to reconnect with the wisdom that has been suppressed. Because when we reclaim our spiritual birthright, we don't just transform ourselves, we transform our communities, our culture, and our collective future. We heal ancestral wounds. We forge new paths of liberation. We create spaces where our children and grandchildren can walk in spiritual authenticity without shame or fear. The power of our ancestral traditions isn't just in their historical significance, it's in their ability to guide us toward a more just, more whole, more liberated future. It's in their ability to remind us who we are, where we come from, and what we're capable of. Your ancestors are calling. Your authentic self is waiting. Your spiritual birthright is ready to be reclaimed. The question is, will you answer the call?